The topic of this session is going to be on how China is leading the fight against climate breakdown. Just before that, some information we've received. Unfortunately, we've heard that George Galloway was recently detained under the Terrorism Act coming into Gatwick, and that's why he wasn't able to make today's meeting. This is shocking news, but not surprising given the fascist turn we're seeing in this country and the repression, the political repression that's being laid out against everyone. Presumably this is to do with George Galloway's Palestine solidarity, and obviously we oppose this fascist act and send our solidarity to George and his family. So as mentioned, the topic of this one is, sorry, it's cutting out. Can you hear me? The topic of this one is China is leading the fight against climate breakdown. It's possibly one of the lesser controversial topics concerning China. Even people who don't normally consider themselves friends of China, the mainstream press, are recognizing the enormous contributions that China is making. They can't deny, reality. Every week we're hit by statistics which are, truly staggering and show both the scale of China's ambition and, more importantly, what it's able to achieve. Just a couple of examples of those statistics. In 2025, China built 80% of the world's solar panels, 60% of the world's wind turbines, 70% of electric vehicles, 75% of batteries. It installs more green energy than the rest of the world combined. In the first 5 months of this year, it's installed, around 250 gigawatts of energy, which is equivalent to entire countries like Indonesia or Turkey. In recent years, this year or last year, it's been observed that China's CO2 emissions may have peaked, which was 5 years ahead of the planned targets for that achievement. The reason China is able to achieve these incredible successes when more developed countries are unable to is due to the centralized leadership of the Communist Party of China and their economic control, fundamentally. This enables rational, long-term planning, and as I mentioned, these things are often completed ahead of schedule. Chinese President Xi Jinping has some prominent policies and concepts, the ecological civilization and the clear waters and green mountains, which push these policies and actions forwards. We don't really need to spend too much time comparing with this country. We certainly don't have clear waters in our country. And in America, the chaotic political system means there's constant flopping in terms of environmental policy, not that they've ever been particularly enthusiastic about it. And China is now exporting this qualitative shift in energy globally in the way that they are also changing and solidifying the global institutions for diplomacy, governance, finance, and others. Now, in ecological infrastructure, they're building an alternative to the Western destructive system. One of these methods is the Belt and Road Initiative, and the announcements in recent years of a rejection of coal power plants involved with the Belt and Road Initiative is truly world-changing. These improved tech in solar, wind, nuclear, and other green industries allow for global South nations and developing nations to pursue more viable, sustainable development paths. It's a kind of leapfrogging of tech. In some countries, they skipped from landlines and just started with mobile phones, and now we're seeing in developing nations that they can skip fossil infrastructure and move straight ahead to green industries. And China's model supports this with equitable financing and win-win partnerships in terms of their diplomatic approach. And even, as I mentioned, somewhere like the New York Times, which is not considered any friend of China, recently wrote an article about wind farms being built in Laos. And they said, where American bombs once fell, Chinese wind turbines now rise, which just encapsulates the whole differing approach. And we should be recognizing the importance of this in terms of geopolitics. Green infrastructure is more resilient in terms of imperialist encirclement and also natural disasters. So by building this kind of infrastructure, it allows sovereign nations to resist imperialist aggression. And we've seen this in the case of China rebuilding Cuba's energy infrastructure, which also helps it in terms of the frequent tropical cyclones and so on that affect it. And when you consider that China has exported green tech to 191 out of the 192 UN member states in the last year, it shows the extent of this geopolitical shift. So to learn more about this world historic transformation, we've got some excellent speakers who will go deeper into these questions. So I should have introduced myself as well. My name's David Peat. I'm the secretary with the Friends of Socialist China Britain Committee and also an editor with Iskra Books. You can come and talk to me upstairs later on. On the panel today, we also have Carlos Martinez, who is an author and a co-editor of Friends of Socialist China, Paul Atkin, who is a political analyst and environmental campaigner, and Yanan Song, who is a professor in global politics at SOAS. So first, Paul.
Surrender. Okay. I should explain, I edit the Greener Jobs Alliance newsletter and convene the National Education Union Climate Change Network. But I'm speaking in a personal capacity because both those organisations contain quite wide views on China. This is my view. China's response to the climate crisis aims to build a moderately prosperous socialist society as an ecological civilization. The connection between the two is expressed in the two mountains proposition popularised by Xi Jinping, that green mountains with clear water are as valuable as mountains of gold and silver. So as China grows, it will grow greener. So it's not socialism with green bits, let alone a Khrushchevite vision of the conquest of nature, but green socialism. And the socialism is essential to the greenness. One Australian commentator put it in the grudging way that Western commentators tend to do. The authoritarian regime, his phrase, put the heft of the state behind clean technologies at a scale and pace difficult to imagine in most democracies. What that means is that if you have socialist planning, you can make strategic decisions for the common good that won't be sabotaged by the vested interests that buy elections and control Western democracies. Or as a Canadian commentator put it, China is pushing power sector transformation through central planning. It can build clean infrastructure quickly because China sees the old fossil fuel growth model as increasingly unable to sustain long-term prosperity. To put that another way, if the socialism that's built isn't green, it won't last. China's colossal state-driven investment in what it calls the three news, solar power, electric vehicles, batteries, along with wind power, is leading to a global tipping point as the cost of renewable energy is now cheaper than that generated by any fossil fuel, and set to become even more so. And this is having an impact on countries in the rest of the world that are far from being socialist. Last year, crude oil imports to China fell for the first time in 2 decades, with the exception of the pandemic. The International Energy Agency expects China to hit peak oil in 2027. As China had driven 2/3 of the growth in global oil demand in the decade to 2023, that means that global oil demand is set to plateau and then drop before 2030. This makes continued investment in fossil fuel exploration or power plants increasingly risky. Banks that have traditionally put huge resources into fossil fuel investments are beginning to get cold feet, even as they row back on explicit green commitments. This is, paradoxically, putting the US fossil fuel drive at odds with markets. This is because the sheer scale of China's investments is mind-boggling, and this is increasingly the core driver of China's economy, which is having a global knock-on effect. I mean, at the risk of repeating the points everybody else has made, with just 17.2% of the world's people, China has half of the world's solar, half of the world's wind power, and half of the world's electric cars. Of every 4 offshore wind turbines to be installed globally this year, 3 of them will be in China. Last year, China installed as much renewable power in 1 year as the US has in its entire history. In April this year, just 1 month, China installed more solar power than Australia has in its entire history, at a rate equivalent to a conventional power station every 8 minutes. They're building, as Fiona said, they're building these enormous solar and wind farms in arid parts of the Western interior. And to give an idea of the scale of these things, they're 2/3 of the way through building a solar farm in Tibet that's the size of Chicago. As a result, China's domestic emissions are peaking, even as demand for energy increases. In fact, energy prices went down in the summer, even as demand for air conditioning boomed during heat waves. Emissions were down 1.6% in the first half of this year. That's vital because China's emissions are 30% of the global total, and if they get it wrong, we're all in trouble. China now has 57% of its electricity generated by renewables, compared to just over 50% to the UK. Right? Coal power is still massive in China, and its rise to prosperity came through climbing up a mountain of it. But coal is now explicitly being defined as backup to a grid structured around new renewables, and there is now significant overcapacity, leading to these plants only operating around 50% of the time. Coal consumption dropped by 2.6% in the first half of this year, even as the economy grew by 5%. Showing that the shift in reliance is picking up pace. Global impact. Although there are a few residual projects, China's decision to abandon coal investment overseas has been pivotal, and now more than 60% of emerging and developing economies are leapfrogging the US and Europe in clean electrification, thanks mostly to China's exports of cheap solar panels. Pakistan last year added as much capacity in rooftop solar as they'd previously been able to generate from their entire grid. This is now being picked up in parts of Africa, with solar panel exports from China up 60% this year. This is from a low base, but the potential is enormous. In countries like Kenya, Morocco, Algeria, Ethiopia, the DRC, Botswana, Zambia, Nigeria and South Africa, solar imports have grown this year by factors of between 3 to 8. Outside Africa, countries like Brazil and Vietnam, the adoption of solar, wind and battery storage is outpacing not only fossil fuels, but also the business as usual strategies of many rich countries, let alone the delirious reactionary stance of the United States. China's clean energy exports in 2024 alone shaved 1% off global emissions outside of China, according to Carbon Brief, and this will accelerate during the next 30 years. Reuters reports that 87% of power generation investment in emerging economies in China flowed into clean energy in 2024, and that means that 3/4 of global fossil fuel demand is now in nations that have already peaked. 3 factors underline this, and these are quotes from Reuters, so not from a source the right-wing press here would call eco-fanatic. One is physics. Fossil fuels are wasteful. 2/3 of the energy in coal, oil or gas is lost to heat or inefficiency. Solar, electric motors and heat pumps are 2 to 4 times as efficient. So we can do a lot more with a lot less at lower cost. This is expressed very well in this graphic. I'm sorry, it's very small, but it says solar panels carried by 1 container ship, that's that little one there, can generate as much electricity as 100 container ships of coal, or 50 container ships of liquefied natural gas. Second is economics. Fossil fuels are commodities built on extraction. As reserves deplete, it gets more expensive to access what's left. Look at the North Sea. Electro-based technology is manufactured, so the more that gets built, the cheaper and better it becomes. On average, costs fall by around 20% every time deployment doubles. Most of the world, solar and wind are now the lowest cost new power. Investment follows. Today, 2/3 of global energy capital flows into electrotech, while oil majors are investing more in stock buybacks than in new wells. Third, geopolitics. The old energy system left 3/4 of humanity dependent on expensive imported fuels. Electro-based technologies unlock local resources. Almost all countries have enough sun and wind to meet their energy needs many times over. And what this means is that the Western model of development is neither available nor needed for the majority of the world. Thanks to China's investment in renewables, they can modernise in their own way, and that means that the future does not and cannot look like the United States. And to elaborate on that last point, China is leading on climate because it is not doing what the US is doing, nor following it in a race to the bottom. Ma Xiaozhu, China's Vice Foreign Minister, says, regardless of how the international situation evolves, China's proactive actions to address climate change will not slow down. As we know, the Trump administration is locking the US into a suicidal entrenchment in increasingly outmoded fossil fuel technology. In rolling back Biden's attempt to suck green investment into the US, Trump has, as many commentators have noted, abandoned the future. This doesn't simply involve domestic economic self-sabotage, with more expensive fossil fuel plants kept running and pushing up bills, offshore wind farms cancelled, imperiling supply in regions like New England, but also a completely reckless wrecking ball taken to disaster emergency relief and any state scientific or academic research related to the climate and the impacts of it. So US academics at international conferences have taken to using burner phones. That means that US policy is based on a set of lies about climate change and actively has to suppress the truth about it. Part of Trump's trade offensive has been to get the US's subordinate allies to buy its exports of LNG, whether they need it or not, and some of this involves fantasy figures, and the US-UK nuclear deal is similarly fanciful. They're aiming beyond the capacity of their own system. But the purpose of it is to lock as much of the world as possible into fossil fuel bondage, US global energy dominance. And that's why the increasingly shrill arguments coming from those overt political subordinates of the US, reform here, with the incredible shrinking Conservative Party yapping along in their wake, with an increasingly panicky right-wing press in full sneering support, are actually aiming at consolidating UK energy dependence on the US. Given the factors outlined above, a success for the US would lock the world and the US itself into climate collapse. The sort of scenario outlined by one of their own think tanks in 2008 as a situation in which, quote, countries with resources themselves would have to engage in nightmarish episodes of triage, deciding who and what can be salvaged from a disordered environment. The choices would primarily have to be made among the poor at home and abroad, something that is in all of our interest to avoid. But while the US still makes some of the weather, literally in this case, it's no longer able to determine the direction of the world, and Trump is increasingly standing on thin ice that's getting thinner as the ice caps melt. As Bill McKibben puts it in his optimistic article, Here Comes the Sun, cue George Harrison track, Big Oil spent more money on last year's election cycle in my country than they've ever done before. And that's why they're now being rewarded with a whole variety of measures designed to slow this transition down, which may succeed. I mean, it's possible that 20 years from now, America will be a kind of museum of internal combustion that other people will visit to see what the olden days were like. But it's not going to slow down the rest of the world much, I don't think. There's obviously a tension in the UK government with its attempts to dodge tariffs by bending the knee and crippling any possibility of positive investment by committing to an annual £77 billion black hole on defence spending, and the stated direction of the Department of Energy Security Net Zero to make the UK an electro-state, which involves some cooperation with China and would require more investment than the military spend will allow. As this crisis unfolds and deepens, the cost of being shackled to the US and the Cold War stance it requires against China will become more and more apparent, and a more live debate in the climate movement, and something we need to inject into mainstream politics in and through the unions, Labour, the Greens and your party. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul, for that excellent contribution, and pointing out the importance of the connection between socialism and green development. You know, the Chinese believe you can't have socialism without prosperity, and you can't have prosperity without a viable ecosystem. So our next speaker is Yanan Song.
thanks again for inviting me to this conference. I am an academic. I work in university, so this is obviously my very first taste of such a conference with so many activists. I'm particularly impressed by how many of you, although not Chinese, show great respect for China's achievements and contributions. As a Chinese, I feel very grateful. Thank you so much. Let me get on to business quickly. Given the title of today's panel, what I'm going to do is to share with you some of my understanding of how China has transformed into a global climate leader. To be very honest, I'm not a specialist in the field of climate change. My academic background is in international relations, but in IR, climate change is still regarded as a very important but new emerging pattern. So I'll try to use this platform to have a kind of fruitful exchange of ideas and thoughts. So when we think of climate change, it is pretty clear that China is already at the very heart of the story. For example, with over 30% of the global carbon dioxide emissions in 2022, China is regarded as the world's largest emitter. But at the same time, it is also increasingly the world's largest global climate actor. So to understand whether humanity succeeds or fails in this climate fight, it will be very interesting and important for us to know how China has moved from a cautious participant to a central leader in its global climate governance. Well, in the early 1990s, China joined the UN climate process with great caution. At that time, it basically insisted on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. The reason behind it was pretty straightforward. It mainly wanted to protect its own right to develop, while at the same time reminding the world that those rich countries had caused most of the problem. But over the past 3 decades, China has already transformed. What actually began as a defensive diplomacy eventually became a kind of proactive climate leadership. And this leadership is expressed in 2 important ways. One is through domestic actions. The other is through international diplomacy. Well, domestically, China has already made or taken many important and remarkable steps in the past years, and I'm sure we've already talked about a lot in today's panels. We've got some very specific, impressive figures, data to share. For instance, let me remind you that, for instance, in the year of 2024, China added around 357 gigawatts of the new wind and solar capacity, which is actually more than the entire renewable capacity of most regions in the world. So very astonishing. And also in the early part of 2025, for the very first time, China's combined solar and wind capacity surpassed its thermal power capacity. And this will absolutely be a kind of symbolic turning point in the global energy mix. And more importantly, China also cut its energy intensity per unit of GDP by 3.8%, beating its target, and will also reduce its carbon intensity by 3.4%. And today, in 2025, almost half of the climate experts in the world already believed that China's emissions reached its peak or will do so by 2025. China set its target as the year of 2030. So as you can see, those numbers are clearly not of a laggard. Those are the numbers of a country that is leading clean energy transition. Well, in addition to those remarkable domestic actions I've just explained, internationally, China has also been very decisive. Recall of knowledge that actually back to the year of 2009 at Copenhagen, China was then criticized as an obstacle. But by 2015 in Paris, China already became a torchbearer. It worked alongside with the United States, with the European Union to ensure an agreement was reached. In other words, without China, there would be no Paris Agreement. And then in 2020, President Xi Jinping pledged carbon neutrality by 2060. And that single announcement has already greatly reshaped the global expectations and pressured the other countries to raise their ambitions as well. And today, in 2025, facing a very, sort of climate hostile Trump administration in the United States, even the UK is turning to China as a partner. The UK is working together with China in many different but very critical issues like supply chains, clean technology, clean energy, and critical minerals as well, hoping to form a bloc with countries like China, European Union, and developing countries to counterbalance Trump and others. So this is what we can see as a leadership, right? This is what leadership should look like. When others retreat, China steps up. China steps up to offer cooperation, to offer technology, and more importantly, to offer a new vision of multipolar climate action. Well, bearing those successful domestic and international actions in mind, then we may wonder, how can we explain this rise? How can we explain China's rise into a global climate leader? Because I work in the field of international relations, so I've tried to apply some sort of relevant IR theories to explain the case of China, but I'll try not be too theoretical, too academic. So very, very briefly, first of all, domestic politics theory shows how domestic pressures, especially the public anger over pollution, the need for stable growth, as well as the quest for legitimacy has driven the Chinese leaders to prioritize the climate action. So that is to say, in China, clean air, green growth are not luxuries. They are actually essential to the political stability. Secondly, of course, Chinese IR theories provide a very important lens. For example, Tianxia system theory, all under the heaven, and I believe you are all very much familiarized with it, explains a kind of world that problems should be resolved collectively rather than through domination. And similarly, the relational theory highlights the importance of networks and partnerships. So all those together explains why China leads so differently. China doesn't seek to become a hegemon in a global climate governance. Instead, China positions itself as a bridge between the global north and the global south, a bridge between developed and developing countries, and a bridge between east and west. In addition to this kind of relatively successful leadership role, of course, challenges remain. China is still very much reliant on coal, and the global markets still fear very much about the over-dependence on China's clean energy, clean technology supply chains. But this is also where we see a leadership should look like. Rather than denying those challenges, China is actively addressing those challenges. China is investing billions to replace coal with renewables. China is siting solar panels, wind turbines, and the electric vehicles across global south, and actually also across global north. For instance, today we've already seen many BYD electric vehicles in many of the European countries here, right? And very recently, last week, I've got a chance to meet with the consulting team from China who are helping Xiaomi expand overseas and establish its presence in Germany. And that team feels very much optimistic about the prospects, so fingers crossed. As you can see, far from dominating through coercion, China is actually sharing solutions. China is building infrastructure. China is financing green projects in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. So this kind of South-South cooperation is one of the clearest examples of a climate leadership in practice. I know my time is limited, so let me conclude. Although China is still the largest emitter, it is also the largest climate leader. Others may retreat, others may roll back, but China is stepping up. And in doing so, China is not going to reshape its own future, but also to reshape the future of the whole planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Yanan Song, and I'm sorry to all of the speakers that, in the purposes of time, we couldn't listen to more. That was very interesting, though, particularly the point about how the green growth actually sustains the revolutionary project and the domestic legitimacy. I thought that was very interesting. So last but not least, we have Carlos Martinez.
All good? Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks, David, and thanks very much, Yanan. Thanks very much, Paul, for really interesting insights so far. I'll try and keep it brief. It's an interesting conversation, China and climate change, because on the one hand, China's got a reputation, at least among Western politicians and among Western journalists, as a sort of climate criminal, right? China is, and has been for the last 15 years or so, the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. I think it's responsible for around 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions. China still burns a lot of coal and so on. And a lot is made of that. It is important to introduce a bit of context there, that China's a massive country of 1.4 billion people. So if you look at its per capita emissions, they're actually very normal. It's kind of around the median, similar to the levels of Iceland, similar to the levels of the Czech Republic, and half the levels of those of the United States, half the levels of Canada. And of course, China is still a modernizing, developing, industrializing country. It's the workshop of the world, right? And if you look at cumulative emissions, so because greenhouse gases stick around in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, if you look at the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere right now, the United States alone is responsible for a full 25% of those, in spite of having only around 4% of the world's population. China's responsible for 13% of the cumulative emissions, in spite of having a population of around 18% of the global total. So, it's very important to contextualize this conversation about China as a climate criminal by saying that this is a crisis that was created by North America and by Europe. Nonetheless, it's obviously very handy for our politicians and for our journalists to blame China. As has been outlined by the previous speakers, China is in fact making remarkable progress, which is increasingly very difficult to ignore. When China is responsible for 50 or 60% of all solar energy production on the planet, when it's responsible for 60, 70% of all wind power production on the planet, then you can't ignore it unless you really, really, really want to. So increasingly, it feels like the environmental movement, at least, is trying to understand that, okay, if we want to save the planet, if we want to prevent crossing these various ecological tipping points, if we want to prevent climate catastrophe, we have to pay some attention to what China is doing, and we have to work with China. China's in the position where it's been described by Erik Solheim, who's a former Norwegian Minister for the Environment and a former United Nations Under-Secretary General. He describes China as the indispensable country for everything green. And Pablo Ginarte, the representative from the Cuban embassy in the introduction this morning, described China as the global engine of the green transition, which I think is a good and a fitting phrase. Coal use is still relatively high in China, as was mentioned by Paul and by Yanan, but it's gone from over 80% a couple of decades ago to under 50% now. And according to the International Energy Agency, China's investment in renewable energy and its innovations in renewable energy technology has been such that the cost of solar power, the cost of wind power globally has decreased by 70 to 80%, to the point where if you're building a power station somewhere in the world now, particularly in the global south, it's likely cheaper, more cost effective for you to use solar power or wind power rather than fossil fuels. China has 95% of the world's electric buses. It's got more high-speed rail miles than the rest of the world combined. China has 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail miles and growing, and that compares with Britain's 113. So it compares sort of fairly favorably. Chinese electric cars make up 60% of worldwide sales. China is the world leader in forestation, so China's forest coverage has gone from around 12% a few decades ago to around 24-25% now, so it's literally doubled during a period where in most of the rest of the world forest coverage has decreased. China is also a world leader in biodiversity protection, animal conservation, and so on. Meanwhile, in the West, we talk about climate change a lot, we talk about environmentalism a lot, we talk about saving the planet a lot, but we're not actually doing very well. If you look at what's happening in the US, in Britain, in Europe, in Japan, in Canada, we've made precious little progress. Various governments have committed to getting to net zero by 2050. But to be frank, and sorry to break it to you, it's sheer fantasy. Trump has just pulled out the Paris Agreement for the second time. In as much as there has been a reduction in emissions, like there has been some level of reduction in emissions in Europe at least, that's basically a function of exporting emissions to the global south. And China, it comes along with exporting industry, exporting manufacturing around the world. It's not that we've made any compromises in our living standards, or that we've made any serious innovations when it comes to renewables. And meanwhile, we're failing, our governments are failing, our economy is failing, our big businesses are failing. But we're in this sort of neoliberal hellscape where the blame is individualized. It's our fault. And if you want to save the planet, then you have to take really short showers, and you have to travel less, and you have to recycle more, etc. No more burgers if you want to save the planet. And meanwhile, our governments, we look the other way while Israel drops white phosphorus on Gaza, and similar environmental crimes that are taking place as part of this genocide. We replace Russian gas with US fracked liquid natural gas, which is cooled to minus 70 degrees below zero, and then shipped across the Atlantic. I mean, from an ecological point of view, it's an absolute disaster. And there's lots of talk of Green New Deals and all the rest of it, and we have successful radical left politicians that put forward the Green New Deal, so that it's sort of part of the conversation, but everyone knows that it's considered as this fringe, mad, radical idea that's never going anywhere. Meanwhile, in China, it's literally happening. They're rolling out a Green New Deal on an unprecedented and kind of almost unimaginable scale. So, the capitalist West is failing while China is succeeding. And I just want to conclude by talking about a little bit like why China, why is China making this incredible progress? Why is China putting this huge effort, these huge resources into the project of preventing climate breakdown, protecting the natural environment? And my thesis, not to give it too grand of a term, is that it must be related to the class character of the Chinese state. It must be connected to the fact that the capitalist class in China, the people who own and deploy capital, are not the ruling class, and they don't get to call the shots, and they don't get to define the overall trajectory and priority of the economy. There's no fossil fuel lobby in China. You don't have CEOs of oil and gas companies saying, no, we better avoid all of this investment in renewables. China's got an essentially planned economy. Even the private sector is heavily regulated. The banks are publicly owned. When the big banks are publicly owned, that means that investment decisions are made on the basis of the public interest and on the basis of medium and long-term interests, and not just short-term interests. So you've got this priority of people and planet over profit. To my mind, that is the fundamental reason that China has emerged as the undisputed leader in the fight against climate breakdown. The fundamental reason is its socialist system, and that's a lesson to take away, right? Only socialist planning can effectively address the crisis our planet faces. And to end with a quote from Guillaume Sewing in a book that's published by Iskra recently called Communism, the Highest Stage of Ecology, he says, "Relying on capitalism to save our environment is like relying on arms dealers to ensure world peace." Thank you very much.
Thanks to Carlos and all the speakers for fantastic contributions. And just to summarize, in that China represents a different path from the suicidal one America and the West has in terms of their energy policy and their environmental program. Telling China's ecological story is like an existential importance. So take this away with you, tell your friends. Okay, so thanks so much, everyone. And next, we have the closing rally. So please stick around for that.